The United States has been living a major health crisis, approaching 1 million overdose deaths over the past 20 years. People of color use and sell drugs at lower rates than white people, and yet they face much more severe consequences of substance use, including death, incarceration, and illness. I'm a social worker and an expert on substance use disorders and health equity. Reflecting over my personal and professional experiences, I grew frustrated with the American healthcare system that treats substance use disorders as an individual problem, despite evidence that social determinants of health, such as poverty and discrimination, play a significant role. I have learned that if we are to truly heal substance use disorders, we must adopt multi-level solutions that integrate a biopsychosocial approach informed by trauma, history, context, social justice, and compassion. I believe that social workers are well poised to lead the way given our training in social justice. I would like to invite you to join us in dialogue through a webinar series sponsored by the Council on Social Work Education and funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Our goal is to get together and reimagine the field of substance use disorder treatment through innovative social work education, practice, and research. Will you join us?
Hi, everyone. It's very exciting to be here. My name is Lily Windsor. I am Associate Dean for Research and Associate Professor of Social Work at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And I conduct community-based participatory research to promote health equity in the fields of substance use disorder, criminal justice, and infectious disease. I am honored to be moderating the CSWE webinar series. And I would like to thank CSWE for putting it together, and also would like to thank Joseph Bass, Javier Cabrera, and Crystal Pagis for assisting in the development and implementation of the series. Today, we have two wonderful speakers. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Kevin Tan and Dr. Ryan Heath as our second webinar presenters. Dr. Kevin Tan's research focuses on promoting social-emotional learning among K-12 populations, particularly in the ways SEL serves as a protective factor against youth risk behaviors. In more recent years, his work pivoted to understand the ways SEL serves as a lever for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Dr. Tan is an associate professor at the School of Social Work with an affiliate appointment at the College of Education. Additionally, he's editor-in-chief for Children in Schools, one of 4 journals published by the NASW Press. He has widely published work in the area of youth risk and protective factors, family influences, and school social work practice. Dr. Ryan Heath is an assistant professor at the School of Social Work at Syracuse University. He was previously a school-based social worker and ran after-school summer and therapeutic adventure programs. His research focuses on the role of organized activities during out-of-school time, like after-school and summer programs, in the development of historically marginalized youth, including the use of these programs as one pillar of community schools. Today, they will discuss the influence of social-emotional learning and non-cognitive factors on youth outcomes, specifically focusing on substance misuse. They will highlight prevailing school-based best practices to prevent substance misuse as it relates to the multi-tiered system of support framework. But before we start, I want to cover a few housekeeping issues. Well, I will be the CSWE lead consultant in substance use disorders for the year. So if you have questions on this topic, feel free to email me and I can point you in the right direction. You can easily find me on Google. And you have a large audience. So if during the presentation you have questions and comments, write them down, and then we will be reserving about 30 minutes at the end for questions and discussion. So you'll be able to be posting those questions on the chat. And I will be reading them as well as your comments so that Dr. Tan and Heath can respond. We may not get to all of the questions, but I will try. And with no further ado, I would like to pass the stage on to my dear presenters and colleagues, Dr. Tan and Heath. Please take it away.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Windsor. It's our pleasure to be here, and good afternoon to all of you, wherever you may be across the country. Today's topic is titled The Promise of Transformative Social and Emotional Learning and Positive Youth Development to Prevent Substance Misuse. And I thought let's start off with just some brief introduction. If we go to the next slide, please, Ryan. All right, and all of you should have your chat function here, and I would like to invite all of you to post in chat 3 words or 3 phrases that will best describe yourself. All right, let's do a quick check-in to see who is in the room right now. For instance, for myself, I will introduce myself as a school social worker. I used to work as a school social worker for 6 years before I entered a PhD program into academia. I do work around social and emotional learning, specifically in K-12 population, as what Dr. Windsor has mentioned. And here's a little thing about me. I'm a father. I have a 7-year-old boy, and he's definitely keeping me on my toes and keeping me busy. So those are the 3 words or 3 phrases that best describes myself. Dr. Heath?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Tan, and thank you, CSWE and Dr. Windsor, for having us today. We're very excited to be here. So if I were to choose 3 words or 3 phrases, the first I might pick would be youth worker, referring to my past professional development experience. As Dr. Windsor was referring to, I've worked in a lot of youth development programs, both during and after school, as well as a school-based social worker. The second one I might pick would be a researcher educator, in reference to my current professional life, working in the School of Social Work and viewing my role as to help future social workers think about and even reimagine the way they might work with young people. And then if I were also to choose the last one, I would also go with father, and I would choose a happy father of 2. Not that it's a contest with Kevin. And there's the happy father picture for you all. Because as I imagine many folks here know, parenting is all smile, unicorns, and rainbows.
Oh, nice. All right, yeah, let's take a moment. If y'all could just post 3 words or 3 phrases that best describe yourself. So at least, both Ryan and I could get to know, who is in the room, who is here. While you're doing that, let me cover the learning objectives for today. We are going to be talking firstly for participants, for all of you to really understand the influence of non-cognitive social emotional factors on youth outcomes. We will focus on substance misuse. The next learning objective is for us to really understand the importance of the systemic approach to really identify students for multi-tiered interventions. And this is where we're talking about best practices that is going on in schools. And the third point there is really for participants to gain at least 1 new insight on this whole notion about transformative social and emotional learning, which is really the cutting edge perspective as it relates to the ways positive youth development and social emotional skills can enhance our understanding of systemic issues and racism that is going on. This is what we will cover next for our agenda. Dr. Heath? Dr. Heath will first start off by giving an overview about SEL and positive youth development. And from time to time, we'll pause and take a short reflection just to digest the information that has been presented. Subsequently, I will come in and I'll talk about this whole notion about transformative social and emotional learning approaches and best practices that is going on in schools as it relates to universal screening and multi-tiered systems of support. And the last part of it is we will introduce and we'll share with you work that we have both done respectively as it relates to social and emotional skills, positive youth development, and the way it relates to preventing substance misuse. All right, so I'll hand it over to you, Ryan.
Sure. And so as given those objectives and that agenda, I want folks to think about today, what we're going to talk about is a set of principles to help us reimagine the way we might work with young people in schools. And so we're not going to leave here today with the credential for the newest based individual-oriented therapy to treat substance use disorder. As you might have heard from my bio, I'm not a specialist in direct treatment of substance use disorder, but rather thinking systematically and systemically how we might prevent substance use among children and adolescents. And so to get there and to think systemically, as Kevin was referring to, want us to think a little bit about the historical context before we got to this current moment. If we think about some of the early substance use prevention initiatives that happened, if we think back to the 1920s and some of the early legislation at that time, and the messaging and what we might think of as propaganda even came out addressing substance use and the concerns about substance use by youth specifically. What it really worked to do is effectively drum up a lot of concern, maybe even hysteria among families and parents about what would happen to young people if they engage with these substances. And we can see from some of the propaganda here that fear was actually even exploited sometimes in those public messaging. And so think about how that led into the next few decades when I was growing up here in the US and the substance use prevention initiatives that were happening at that time. We might think of Nancy Reagan and the Just Say No campaign leading into the DARE, drug abuse resistance education that was in a lot of schools. And the infamous, maybe famous public service announcements on television. This is your brain on drugs and how to just say no. And through all that, likewise, we can also see the ways in gender and race and intersectionality kind of played in the way the war on drugs played out. That all led us up to the 1990s and 2000s, where we might have started to see a little bit of pushback. I presume pushback existed before, and one way it took form in the 1990s and 2000s is this movement of positive youth development. So that term positive youth development often can refer to a few things. It can refer to a set of outcomes that we might hope young people could achieve. It might refer to a philosophy or a set of principles to guide our work with young people, or sometimes it refers to youth development programs that use those principles in order to achieve that broad set of developmental outcomes. And so from the start, the positive youth development movement was really trying to look holistically at youth. It was noting that a lot of prevention campaigns was working in a little bit siloed way, that there was substance use prevention, teen pregnancy prevention. And what the positive youth development movement aimed to do is acknowledge that those things don't exist in a vacuum, right? A young person isn't just having trouble at school, just engaging with substances on the weekend, just having troubles at home. All those things interact. And so from the start, positive youth development was intended to address youth outcomes holistically. There are a few different ways that different scholars and institutions summed up those sets of outcomes we might want among young people. Richard Lerner from Tufts had one popular framing on the 6 C's of positive youth development, which included competence across a variety of domains, confidence, so the psychological abilities, and belief in oneself to exercise that competence, connection to various social contexts around a young person, character, or the set of values, pro-social values that would help one engage in caring to others, as well as make a contribution to their community. So the 6 C's of positive youth development was one way it was framed. The Search Institute in Minnesota also had a set of developmental assets, and that was another way in which positive youth development was framed. And there was a set of external assets, which were intended to build a set of internal assets among young people. And so today, not going to go through all the nuances of each of these, rather might think of our work here today as to point you in some directions. And so you'll receive a set of resources which will include additional details on these frameworks. What I want folks to think about is the set of principles that we might use in order to achieve that holistic set of outcomes among young people. And so principles of positive youth development are the way in which we might work with young people. That would include focusing on positive development and building strengths. That aligns well with the strength-focused nature of social work. Again, it was holistic in nature from the start. And it was also intended to be universal from the start. This is a thread we'll see kind of weave throughout our topics today. From the start, positive youth development made the argument that all young people, regardless of their level of risk or behaviors, might benefit from programming that employed these principles. And so it was intended to be universal in nature from the start. Programming was intended to leverage positive youth-adult relationships as one of the major mechanisms for producing those positive youth development outcomes. Programming were to embody practical skills and help young people learn those practical skills and employ them. Work should be place-based or community-based to help connect those young people to the places around them and the community around them, and actually also help to integrate the multiple social contexts in which young people embody to help them make a contribution to those multiple contexts. So these were a set of principles to guide the work in positive youth development programs. And so for the research on positive youth development programs, this may or may not come as a surprise to the group of social workers here, but when looking at some meta-analyses examining some of those previous drug abuse resistance education, substance use prevention campaigns, they weren't very effective. Those programs that utilized fear-based messaging, such as images or language or talk of consequences that was intended to elicit an emotion of fear among young people, were actually found to be largely ineffective at affecting substance use rates. And we might think about how that makes sense given where child and adolescent brain development is. We'll come back to that a bit later. On the other hand, positive youth development programs that embody these principles in a very consistent way were found to have much more consistent associations with lower substance use among young people. I think one of the most comprehensive reviews was done by Richard Catalano and David Hawkins to social workers, notably. They looked at every positive youth development program they could find an evaluation for, and several of them had associations with lower substance use. Likewise, these findings have been reaffirmed in some more recent studies. But in particular, Catalano and Hawkins looked at these constructs and when they showed up in positive youth development programs. These were 15 common themes they found across a whole breadth of programs. Bonding, to attachment placed to people. Resilience, or being able to bounce back from hardship. Competence, again, across a variety of domains. Self-determination and self-efficacy, being able to persevere and belief in one's ability to do so. Having a clear positive identity, clear positive belief about the future. Young people being recognized for positive behavior, having opportunities to be involved in pro-social ways, and surrounded by a set of pro-social norms were all common themes in some youth development programs, in addition to spirituality being another element. And I went through their review again recently, and the ones that were most clearly linked to lower substance use were programs that emphasize that bonding, or that attachment piece. They emphasize those competencies. They emphasized self-efficacy, identity, and they recognized young people for positive behavior, gave them opportunities for that behavior, and gave them a set of pro-social norms. There was one program that emphasized resilience. It really was the other 10 that was most common among the positive youth development programs with impacts on youth substance use. Now, I mentioned some of these findings have been reaffirmed in recent studies, and so in a couple of systematic reviews, a few interesting themes came out that I think are relevant to our conversation today. The first is that self-regulation emerged as one common mechanism through which positive youth development program would be associated with lower substance use later on. So a young person's ability to manage their thoughts, emotions, and behaviors was related to their substance use later on. That makes sense. When we think about school programs specifically, there were two interesting findings I wanted to highlight. One was that there were mixed results for lecture-based programs in schools. That aligns with some of the meta-analyses I referred to previously, that fear-based and didactic approaches weren't that effective at changing youth substance use rates. And then interestingly, there were also mixed results for programs that were solely for at-risk youth. And this taps into the universality principle that I referred to earlier. Some of them were helpful, but programs that were universal were more consistently associated with lower substance use among young people. Now, I really sort of see the heyday, if you will, positive youth development as the mid-2000s, 2010s. And in that time, there started a similar movement, or related movement, I should say, emerge around social emotional learning. Whereas positive youth development, right, was trying to get agencies, including schools, to think more holistically. Part of that holistic thinking was not just about academic outcomes, but about social emotional. And social emotional learning really sort of took off, and in both common literature here, as well as scholarly literature, is now actually having greater attention paid to it than positive youth development. And I say that so that when we're thinking here today about how to use social emotional learning and leverage that to reduce youth substance use rates, I want folks to kind of see the connection, how these two movements have fed off of one another and evolved together. Now, I imagine a lot of folks here have probably heard the term social emotional learning. Many folks may even be running social emotional learning groups or implementing SEL curricula. To bring everyone sort of to the same base, we might think of social emotional learning as the process through which young people acquire the skills and knowledge and attitudes they need to achieve a variety of positive youth development outcomes, including healthy identity, ability to manage emotions, ability to achieve goals, to feel and show empathy for others, to establish and maintain relationships, and make caring and responsible decisions. So there are a lot of terms that overlap with SEL. And another resource I might point folks to, if you're interested in some of these SEL frameworks, to look at a blog post Kevin and I did a couple of years ago on SEL frameworks and their connection to school social work. Today, we'll primarily look at the CASEL framework with a few references to a second framework I was part of, the Young Adult Success framework. So folks may have seen this set of concentric circles from the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning before. When CASEL started out, it framed social emotional learning as happening in these 5 domains: self-awareness and self-management as a few self-oriented domains, social awareness and relationship is socially oriented, and responsible decision-making is behavioral. Self-awareness was the ability to understand one's emotions, thoughts, and values and how they influence behavior. And self-management was the ability to manage those emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. Social awareness was the ability to understand the perspectives and empathize with the perspectives of others, including those from different backgrounds. And relationship skills were the ability to establish and maintain healthy and supportive relationships with others and effectively navigate those relationships with diverse individuals and groups. And the last and 5th domain of the CASEL framework was responsible decision-making, the ability to make caring, constructive choices about personal behavior, again, across different social contexts. And so as CASEL evolved, they started to recognize more and more the role of context and larger context. And so the model evolved to include the concentric circles. And those might be the places we might think about our work as social workers looking to work systematically at promoting SEL, including creating developmental settings. That might be the institutions in which we work, developmental relationships, our relationships individually with young people, and developmental experiences, what we actually do with young people that over time can be building those 5 domains of social emotional learning. Developmental settings we might think of as having safety, both physical and psychological, having appropriate structure given the developmental stage of the young people there, giving young people opportunities to belong to that setting and to matter there. That setting having a set of positive social norms that can be modeled for young people's self-efficacy, again, being supported, opportunities for concrete skill building, integration across context, and opportunities for supportive developmental relationships there. Those developmental relationships we might think of as being relationships with an adult, where the adult is supportive. It supports the young person in the face of challenge, but it also provides challenge and challenges the young person in ways that helps them grow. The young person is caring, the adult is caring towards the young person and actually shares power in developmentally appropriate ways, allows for space for decision-making by the young person or by the youth. And lastly, promotes new possibilities for the young person. And so within the context of that relationship, what we might promote in order to build SEL are what I frame here as developmental experiences. These are ongoing, iterative cycles of action and reflection. So engaging in some concrete action and providing the space for reflection. The idea being there is that young people are always constantly making sense of their experience. And so I would argue it behooves us as social workers to intentionally structure that so it might promote their social emotional learning. Opportunities for action might include being able to tinker with something new, to make a choice about what they're doing, to practice a skill to mastery, to contribute to a group or community, or to encounter somewhere new or a new person or a new setting. We might provide some of those action experiences for young people and then couple it intentionally with an experience of reflection, where young people either simply describe what happened, or maybe they can evaluate what happened, what worked about that, what was ineffective about that. Did it work when you called Johnny that name? Did it not work when you called him that name? help them connect it to what you've done previously with them, envision ways they might use those skills in the future, and integrate it with their other contexts of learning. Now, I would frame the literature linking SEL to substance use and misuse as not quite as fully developed as positive youth development, which makes sense given the attention paid to SEL is a little bit newer. However, when I looked through in preparation for this talk, I did see some consistency around a couple different mechanisms I want to highlight, including self-efficacy, or the belief that one is able to complete a task or learn to complete a task, and self-regulation, again, managing one's emotions, thoughts, and behaviors in goal-directed ways. And so there are a few different studies that link that. And so that to me raises some questions about, okay, so maybe those are some of the domains that SEL that might matter for substance use. And so we're going to take a second here to pause and reflect a little bit. We went through a lot of material there. And so I'm curious, given that it was going through a lot of material very quickly, first, what resonated with positive youth development for you all? If you could kindly enter that. I believe chat is disabled, but I think they can answer the questions in Q&A. Am I correct about that? Yes, okay. So either chat or Q&A, wherever you can provide responses. First, I'm curious about what aspects of positive youth development resonated with folks. Secondly, I'm curious of those social emotional factors I described, what queued up for you. Oh yeah, we do that where I work. Yeah, we do that. And then lastly, I'm curious, what's most challenging about working on social emotional learning with the young people in the setting in which you work? And so while folks are thinking about that, I'd actually like to model this conversation with Kevin for a second, if you don't mind, Dr. Tam. You've kept me around for a while working on projects. You've heard me talk about positive youth development lots of times. I'm curious what resonates most with you.
For a long time. Yeah, we have worked with each other for a long time. We've known each other since, doctoral students. What aspects of positive youth development resonates the most with me? It's really about self-regulation. I think, in this, I worked a lot with, high school, young people. I think here self-regulation, it goes beyond just that whole behavioral aspect of it. It's the emotional regulation, the thought, process as well. I think these are things that, it's really important for us to focus on, especially, working with young people. So I think, this aspect of positive youth development resonates the most with me. The second one, which SEL factors do I focus the most? It's really about self-awareness. I think it's so critical. It is so essential, especially in today's context. I'm going to be talking about that in a couple more slides there. Which SEL factor do I find most challenging to work on? I think that's the area about social awareness, all right? Understanding of the other, understanding of different people's cultural aspects, their perspective. I think that's key, that's important, especially with all the challenges that we're facing in today's context. And I'm curious about you, Dr. Heath, given, you just presented, what about yourself? Let's share with that before I jump into my slides there.
So for me, I think the pieces that attracted me most to positive youth development when I started doing positive youth development programs, I was recently out of undergrad in the mid-2000s. I think one was the holistic nature of it. Like it didn't make sense to me. The young people I was working with, they struggled in school. They didn't have strong relationships with the staff at school. The staff, pushed them further out. That led them, to potentially engage in risk behaviors. And so it all felt connected. And positive youth development to me recognized that in a way that I hadn't gotten in some other intervention training I'd received before. For me in my work, I would say I'd also focus on self-regulation. I know you mentioned as well. I'd say that was one. The second one is self-efficacy. I know self-efficacy, I think, is a really important, almost core belief that drives a lot of behavior. Also in the 90s, around that same drug abuse prevention education era, there was a big push for self-esteem. And interestingly, what they found is a lot of those self-esteem interventions weren't closely linked to outcomes later on. So it's not just having young people feel good about themselves, it's about having young people believe they're able to be successful. And so for me, that's the piece to work on for self-efficacy. And I'll pass it off to you there.
All right, thank you. Now, given what we've been talking as well, let's go on to the next slide, please. Ryan has shared with us about positive youth development concepts, social emotional learning concepts there. But I think here, let's pause, let's reflect on all that is going on, in contemporary context with all the struggles, out there. What are we missing over here? All right, let's move on to the next slide. I think here, with regards to working with young people, with regards to understanding about youth risk behaviors, substance misuse, I think it's really important that we frame this conversation within the context of what is going on in society. I think this is where it's really important for us to really consider the role of racial stress and trauma and its impact on young people. All right, just reflect about what went on not too long ago in Memphis. We are just recovering from the pandemic right now. In fact, a lot of momentum, a lot of dialogue has been going on since the summer of 2020 with the murder and killing of Mr. George Floyd. All right, such issues, such conversations, has been going on for many years. All right, but I literally took the killing of Mr. George Floyd, for this racial reckoning and this greater awareness, about issues that is going on. Who would have also expected the January 6th Capitol insurrection to have happened as well? I think what is really important, in understanding about the current social political context, that young people are also observing. Young people are also, more importantly, looking at us adults in how we actually handle and address such situations. And specifically in the area of school context, I think it's also important for us to really understand about this whole notion about politicization of K-12 schools. Social and emotional learning, it's one thing that, we struggle as it relates to, promoting it in certain states across the country. I think that constitutes a challenge with how we come about, promoting social and emotional context, which we know that, it is a protective factor as it relates to youth risk behaviors. Next slide, please. Let's take a moment, let's pause, and let's think about, this whole notion about racial stress and trauma. What exactly do I mean by racial stress, race-based stress? It's really about the events of danger related to real or perceived experience of racial discrimination that brings about an adverse psychological or physiological effect on a young person. Racial trauma, it's something that is cumulative, involves ongoing, direct and indirect, big and small racially charged aggression that exposes or re-exposes individuals to psychological and damaging injuries. And some of these injuries is not only meant physical injuries, emotional injuries as well. What are some of those impacts, as it relates to racial trauma? Let's take a look at this list here, and let's also consider its potential impact on substance use and substance misuse, especially with young people right now. This is from this book, Racial Trauma, all right, which really talks about the wounds, the issues as it relates to racial trauma. It can lead on to an internalized devaluation of the self. It can also be associated with a assaulted sense of self, the notion about learned voicelessness, psychological homelessness, the feeling that I don't belong here. It might also be associated with rage. It might also be associated with loss or invisible grief. Or it might also be associated with this whole notion about constantly trying to seek towards survival, constantly on a survival mode there. I think here, as it relates to understanding youth risk behaviors, especially working with young people, who comes from historically marginalized groups, these would actually be really key, important aspects, that we really need to consider, in the work that we do. Next slide. It's really important, for us, to make bridges with young people around, all right, to help them feel that sense of self, sense of worth. I think this is what Ryan mentioned about the sense of self-efficacy, the confidence in who they are, so much so that, they can really lead on. They are the future of the next generation for us. Next slide, please. We need a better understanding about specifically the notion of racial stress and racial trauma on substance misuse. I think here, if we actually do a scan of the literature in preparation for this session, we do see an emerging set of literature as it relates to the specific impact of racial trauma and racial stress on substance use and misuse. I think this is really an important aspect of it, that we really need to invest a lot more time and resources for us really to understand all that is going on, its impact on young people's youth risk behaviors. And the next slide that we have here, it's really introducing this whole notion about transformative social and emotional learning, which is literally the cutting edge perspective in the social and emotional learning literature, which is really the response to all the issues that is going on socially and politically, in the country today. Let's take a moment to also reflect on what exactly do we mean about transformative social and emotional learning. Transformative social and emotional learning, it's the process by which adults and young people, they collaboratively co-examine, co-develop, and co-implement solutions leading to a just and equitable society that is very much grounded in principles of youth empowerment, identity, agency, and belonging. And I think here the crux of this is really this whole process of collaborative aspect of it between adults and young people in three specific areas. How best, would we be able to promote young people's identity, a sense of who they are, a sense of their agency, what do they hope to see change? How can we nurture their motivations to create change in society? And more importantly, to ground them in places where they feel accepted and belong. I do have examples of how in my own work, I promote transformative social and emotional learning as a protective factor against risk behaviors. We'll get to those slides, towards the end of this presentation. Now, in the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about best practices in schools. What do we do? How about at the school level? And as we go through this series of slides, I hope that we could really think about this whole notion about transformative social and emotional learning. How can we actually more actively promote it within a school context? Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to address the importance of schooling for young people as it relates to substance misuse. And here I think it's really important for us to look at it through an ecological developmental perspective. This is literally the core social work perspective for the person in environment. And here we think about the student nested within the context of classrooms, schools, the district, the community, ecological factors that are more distal and more proximal to young people. And it's also important that we do not forget about the developmental aspect of it. The next click, please. All right. Of how we think about young people for an elementary school age, as compared to a young person at a high school level. All right, different approaches, different intervention approaches are needed based on a developmental context there. All right, let's click the next one. Why is this really important to really understand substance misuse? Think about the ecological context and how each of those will actually impinge, onto young people's risk behaviors. The next slide here, highlights some of these social ecological factors that we know, would serve as protective factors, as it relates to substance misuse. First aspect will be about the notion about the family, all right? Family functioning, substance use, all right? Parental knowledge, parental monitoring. These we know will be protective factors, as it relates against substance use. Literature has also highlighted the whole notion about parental substance use. This highlights, the whole notion about parents, how we could actually address and model some of these substance misuse behaviors, with our young people. Ecological context of the family. Let's talk about the ecological context of the peers. What do we know from the literature? Peer socialization, risk-taking, the friends that you associate with, that also has an impact as it relates to young people's propensity to engage in substance use. Peer comparisons, perceptions. We also know that also has an influence with regards to the propensity for someone to engage in substance use. Unstructured socialization, peer pressure. All right, these will be some of those risk and protective factors as it relates to substance use and misuse. At a community level, access to substances, that is also, an important factor that we need to consider. All right, community connectedness and cohesion, and community enforcement and monitoring. At a school level, these are some of those things, that we need to consider as it relates to, risk and protective factor, school culture and climate, school connectedness and belonging. And here this last point, early warning systems as it relates to identifying students at risk, and how best would we be able to provide the necessary intervention and supports early on. Next slide, please. I think this whole aspect relates to the importance of systemic screening and response. And this is also one of those best practices that we know in schools as it relates to developing multi-tier systems of support. It's supposed to really to understand and identify and to know what program by whom is most effective for this individual or groups of individuals with a specific problem and under what set of circumstances. Next slide, please. Prevailing best practices, within a school context is really about understanding a multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS. Years back, it was also more prevalent called, response to intervention, which is really identifying, interventions, supports, at a universal level. What are those things that we could do at a broad level that impacts and attracts and influence all students? What are those interventions that we could do at a targeted level, groups of students? And who are those students that we need to focus more attention on at the intensive level, the tier 3? And this is very much a public health approach to understanding, risk behaviors, early prevention and detection. Move on to the next slide. And this whole approach of developing multi-tiered systems of support within schools, all right, how we can identify students that is in need for intervention, how we can appropriately respond and monitor students. It's really based on the guiding principles, systemic universal screening approach, a multi-tiered intervention approach, continual ongoing monitoring process. And a key component here is really a data-based decision-making process. And this is some of the work that I've also been doing here with the districts that I work with. It's a universal screening of social and emotional needs there, where we could really identify students with higher social and emotional concerns and needs, and how best we can actually better promote social and emotional skills and really support them accordingly. Such approaches is not a one-size-fits-all approach. It literally considers the whole child involving both academic, behavioral, mental health, social, emotional domains there. How would that look? Let's move on to the next slide there. Tier 1, universal approach there. We could be thinking along the lines of what are those policies or universal programs and practices, all right, that can prevent and address propensity to engage in substance use. What are those targeted intervention approaches? For instance, social skills training, support groups, restorative justice practices. Third level, remediation, academic supports. The next slide, I have more specific examples there. All right, these are some of those evidence-based programs, that it's used out there in the schools. For instance, life skills training. All right, one longitudinal study has actually found the rates of lifetime illicit drug use 13 years later, following this life skills training program, were actually lower for students that received the training as compared to the control group. More at a targeted level, you will have programs, all right, targeted at, say, for instance, peer learning, experiential learning approaches. All right, that's some studies over there. And the last part of it, individual treatment modalities. All right, these will be more at the tier 3 level. All right, I'll hand it over to Ryan right now.
So thanks, Kevin, for helping us think about the school level pieces. So we are focusing largely on systematic ways we might work to prevent substance use among young people. I suspect there are some folks here, though, who also work individually with young people. And so Kevin and I like to drop at least a few different nuggets of things people can use when they're working with young people in our presentations. So just wanted to take a couple minutes to drop a few of those in and connect them to the larger systemic strategies Kevin has been talking about. And so for one, a piece in your resource guide you'll find includes information on CASEL's 3 signature practices. And what CASEL has sort of framed these around are large universal things that anyone can do. Is largely targeted at teachers, and it's not just limited to teachers. It could be other school staff, or it could even be folks working in other agencies. Things they can do on a universal level to be building relationships with young people that they can use to leverage and enhance their social emotional learning. they sum up their 3 signature practices. First, as a set of welcoming activities or rituals, a second set around engaging pedagogy, and third around activities closing with optimism. And so for the first one, what they encourage are a set of rituals that help connect the young people to the adults there, as well as provide a sense of stability and what can be expected for interactions and every class or every time a young person or an adult meet or every time a group meets. So for example, I believe one of them, they provide an example of includes teachers waiting at the door and simply saying hello to everyone as they come in, checking in with the person. Hi, Tommy, how are you doing? Hi, Jane, how was your game last night? Hi, Tommy, how did the play go last weekend? Those kind of very small things that signal to a young person, this adult here is welcoming me into the space. They know me, I matter, and they care about me. The idea being that relationship building can then be leveraged further in the classroom through engaging pedagogy that fosters social emotional learning. And so the engaging pedagogy piece will vary, of course, in the setting which you're working with. Teachers will have that vary for their curricula. For us as social workers, we might think about what we do with groups of young people or even individually that might engage young folks with experiences that meet some of those positive youth development principles we saw before. So they build concrete skills, or they help young people reflect on their own thoughts, emotions, and behaviors and how they can use them in goal-directed ways. So in addition to the resource guide, yes, our PowerPoint slides will also be available to everyone for attending the presentation. And so the last signature practice CASEL promotes is closing with optimism. And so having some ritual of closing that helps young people close in a hopeful manner, connecting what they've done to what they can possibly do in the future, opening up possibilities for young people based on what has been done. So there's some examples of signature practices you can use in the CASEL guide in your resources, as well as on CASEL's website. They have a whole bunch of different forms of these practices you might implement. Other pieces I like to use and encourage practitioners to think about include the language we use when we speak with young people. And so connecting to the transformative SEL piece and thinking about racial stress and trauma, want to think about person-centered language. That is one thing we probably want to encourage throughout, and I expect some social workers here have experience with. The other one from kind of earlier modalities or earlier versions of social emotional learning involved changing language to use language that encourages a growth mindset. The idea being that a growth mindset, or the belief that one can change one's abilities, helps foster self-efficacy. And today we've seen self-efficacy kind of repeatedly come up as one of those pieces that may be relevant for substance use. And so there are a lot of small changes to our language that we might make when we talk with young people that can help promote a growth mindset, things we might not even have thought about. And so a lot of that can those changes revolve around not classifying or describing any young person as a type of person, right? And so there's a very interesting study around growth mindset where they took a group of young people and they put them in 2 different groups. One group, they all did a task. One group got the feedback, "Oh, you're so smart." And the second group got the feedback, "Oh, you worked so hard." And even though they both got positive feedback, the group that was told, "Oh, you're so smart," actually did worse the second time around they did the task. The group that was told, "Oh, you work so hard," actually did better. And part of the thinking behind that is that when we say, so, "Oh, you're so smart," we're unintentionally signaling to a young person, oh, there are smart types of people and there are not smart types of people. So what we can do to encourage a growth mindset is instead be praising the process and be praising work and effort that folks put in. And so I can see you work so hard on this instead of you are so smart. Likewise, we want to encourage folks to be able to keep working on something when they encounter difficulties. And so rather than something like, "Oh, it's okay, like some people just aren't able to do this. Maybe you're just not a math person," right? Instead, seems like, let's find that you're struggling with this. Let's find a new strategy, right? That doesn't signal to a young person, "Oh, you're not the type of person that can't do this." Rather, we need to find a different strategy. There needs to be a different effort. So there are a variety of examples here. They're also in your resource guide about small ways we can change our language to not be unintentionally signaling to young people that there's types of people that succeed and don't succeed, but rather we can praise young people for the process in which they're engaging, the effort they put in, and signal our belief in them that they're able to do something. And so here, there's some of those examples here. I mentioned that likewise because that's right. That's not one particular set therapeutic modality, right? This can be incorporated across different modalities, across different settings, across different types of interactions with young people. So I'd like to mention that one. The other one I was going to mention was actually talking about the brain with young people. Interestingly, something else that can also help encourage a growth mindset and ultimately self-efficacy among young people is actually talking about the brain and how pliable the brain is. It's actually a lot more flexible than previously was thought in 20 years or so ago in neuroscience. However, the brain is also really complicated. That's why there's the joke about it not being brain surgery, right? So Dan Siegel came up with this hand model of the brain as a way to work with young people. I also think this is great for families and parents that you might work with, as a way to explain the brain and what happens when young people get dysregulated. And so we might think of our hand as our human brain, right? Like imagine this is lining up. This is the front of the brain, this is the back of the head, and this is the neck. And so this lower part of the brain stem highlighted in purple on the slide, is part of responsible for the most basic bodily functions. It's responsible for those fight, flight, or freeze responses that folks have. Higher up from that is the limbic system, or what's called the emotional brain. We might illustrate that as the palm of our hand, including the section called the amygdala, which we might signal as our thumb, which is involved in emotional activation. And then the top, the fingers of our brain, we'll think of as something called the prefrontal cortex. This is the part of our brain that's responsible for thinking and planning and making decisions and self-regulation. You might think of it as the control for the brain, right? And so when our prefrontal cortex is online, right, our fingers have covered over, they're regulating everything. Our emotional brain and our brainstem is kind of in check. So what happens to our young people when they encounter something that is perceived as a threat, right? Their emotion center gets activated, so their lid is flipped up. And what is exposed? Primarily their emotion brain and their brainstem, those fight, flight, or freeze responses, right? And so when we encounter a young person or even an adult who's dysregulated, right, trying to appeal to reasoning and decision-making doesn't always work so well, because literally that part of the brain is not online right now. It's literally not being engaged. The emotion brain and the brainstem is the one that is primarily working at this point. And so you don't necessarily have to remember the anatomical names of those sections of the brain, but I think this can be a really helpful tool for explaining to young people, oh, this is what might happen when you're dysregulated. You can incorporate the language of, let's try and flip your lid back down. How do we get you regulated? And so this can be a tool you potentially use as well. Notably in development, as we get older, it goes up the hand, if you will. And so the prefrontal cortex is last to develop. So if we think back again to all those initiatives at the start that were appealing to young people's reason about not engaging in drugs, if we induce fear, they'll engage in reason, not decide. Young folks, right, still primarily have an emotional brain. And so decisions are a little bit more emotional. So those are just a couple tools you might think about incorporating. Dr. Tan, did you want to add anything before we move on to exemplars? Okay, great. So what we're going to do now is we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about how some of those systemic and even those little approaches played out in a few different school systems in which Kevin and I partner with. And so I'm going to start off first talking about a set of community schools in Wayne County in Western New York. And so Wayne County is a very rural, sparsely populated region in Western New York. Politically, it's pretty conservative, and there's 11 different districts across this county, right? And so that means each district is literally like one elementary school, one middle high school, right? And so you have these very small school districts spread out across this large rural region. And so they engaged in a lot of this work, and I want to attribute this work to them. This wasn't work I did with them. This is work before I started partnering with them. But they were awarded a series of funding to engage in some really expansive school transformation activities. They first received funding in 2014. They did some planning, and really in academic year 2015 to 16, they started pushing several SEL initiatives, not only school-wide, but actually county-wide, so across the county, not just within one school in the district, not even just within one district, but getting a bunch of different districts across the county on board to engage in this wide set of SEL initiatives. And they used that same multi-tiered systems of support framework Kevin was referring to earlier. They organized their efforts based around that. So universally, they did a few different things, including life skills training, that program Kevin in fact mentioned earlier. They've never met Kevin. No one's getting kickbacks for mentioning life skills training here. It just happens to be a very effective tier 1, tier 2 intervention. So they did life skills training. They employed a variety of restorative practices in their schools, including community circles. They used another MTSS framework, PBIS, in order to reduce suspensions and other behavioral issues. Across the districts, they started employing a universal SEL curriculum, as well as using a universal risk and protective factor and health behavior survey across, again, all the schools and all the districts in this county. They also used this framework across the county, which I think is worth noting. They were able to get not only schools, but also community agencies on board with what they call the collaboration arch framework. The folks working in Wayne County compiled a set of research and decided to frame all their work on supporting attachment, regulation, competencies, and health for young people. All 4 concepts, right, that have come up multiple times in this presentation before. Their framework argues that through collaboration, what we should aim to do is encourage attachment among young people to schools, families, and communities, help them build their self-regulation. In doing so, can help them build competencies across a variety of domains and ultimately achieve positive health outcomes. And that collaboration is key to doing so. And so, right, that was a really big universal intervention, not only across schools, but across the county. They also did work at tier 2, though. They coupled a lot of that positive youth development, SEL, universal work with interventions higher up in tiers 2 and 3. That included structuring mentoring programs, a program called Check In, Check Out, that I know is popular, that a lot of social workers I know have used. They used specific SEL groups and prevention programming for young people that they had flagged as at risk. And then at tier 3, case management for sort of the most intensive cases, as well as expanding mental health and substance counseling and treatment in the schools. To do so, they co-located a lot of services with providers around the county. Like a lot of rural areas, it's pretty resource poor, but coordination high. And they leverage that in order to bring in, mental health resources that were largely, inaccessible to a lot of young people beforehand. So they started all this right in 2015, 2016. And as a result of using that universal risk and protective and health behavior survey, they were actually able to start making some database decisions in the same way that Kevin referred to earlier. And so we'll see a few slides when it comes to substance use here. So 2015, before they start engaging, 2015-16, we start to see a little bit of a drop in drinking alcohol over their lifetime, getting it to even below 40% for high schoolers. So think about that, high schoolers, less than 40% have ever had alcohol, reporting ever having used alcohol in their lifetime in the schools. On these graphs, the blue refer to middle school students, and the orange bars refer to the prevalence among high school students. Smoked marijuana in their lifetime, we see another, again, below 25% of high schoolers had reported ever smoking marijuana in their lifetime. And where I think is actually some of the most dramatic results is recent use of marijuana. Before engaging in these large, extensive, multi-tiered systems of support, right, over half of high school students reporting using marijuana in the last 30 days. A few years later, less than 20% consistently. And this is even through the pandemic. A lot of these changes maintained. Now note, some of these rates were going down generally across New York. If you chart the New York rates next to them, they're also going down, but these are a lot more dramatic than New York State or other rural areas. Other drugs in lifetime, we see a similar kind of drop and then flattening out. Same with cigarettes across their lifetime. And then one place, though, they found a little sticky, and I'd be open to having a discussion about this in Q&A if other folks are finding this, is among vaping and e-cigarettes. They've had a harder time leveraging that. However, because they have this universal data, right, they're able to know what's going on with their young people and be able to identify where they need to make interventions. Now, in addition to that, though, they're not just looking at health behaviors, right? They're looking at the risk and protective factors associated with those behaviors. And so not only do they know what behaviors are of concern right now, they can link them to specific risk and protective factors among young people in the county. And so for these folks, these charts right here, the numbers roughly refer to a correlation between a risk or protective factor and a substance use behavior later on. Higher numbers meaning higher correlation. And so remember, they're using that ARCH model: attachment, regulation, competencies, and health. Substance use behaviors we'll think of as health behaviors. So when it comes to regulation, right, sensation seeking as part of self-regulation linked to all three: alcohol, marijuana, other drug use, and impulsiveness and rebelliousness in particular, not associated with alcohol, but with marijuana and other drug use. So again, they now have abilities to make data-based decisions. If they want to target alcohol, they know to look at sensation seeking. They're interested in lowering the other rates, right? They have a few other domains of self-regulation to look at. When they look at competency, social skills, there's some correlation, but not really very high. Self-efficacy was, again, one that comes back up when it comes to other drug use. And then lastly, when looking at attachment factors, this county is interested, again, in finding ways to actually leverage what they have in order to make a change in these outcomes. So if you look at the risk factors, lack of attachment to family, school, and community, attachment to family and community are the ones that are lacking right now. My interpretation of this is by 2021, they've largely worked out the attachment to school, right? And so they're not seeing as high of a correlation because there's a little bit higher attachment to school. On the other hand, lack of attachment to family and community has a high correlation with marijuana and other drug use. And so that gives them a direction to move in the next few years. They know, for the most part, they've worked out school attachment pretty successfully since 2015. Now they're looking to use their community schools model to think about family and community. So I like to highlight that example as a combination of both those tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 interventions addressing SEL and the way they used universal data in order to demonstrate some changes in their county.
All right, nice. Thank you, Ryan. We'll take the last 5 minutes here, for me to be sharing with all of you, work that I've been doing as it relates to promoting transformative social and emotional learning. And let me give a shout out first, to CSWE, for, organizing this series. And, let me remind everyone about the title of this series, Reimagining, social work practice. All right. And, hopefully, in this session, you will have some additional ideas, about our work that we do in engaging young people. All right. Specifically, and as it relates to preventing substance misuse. I think here, this whole notion about transformative social and emotional learning is one approach that I've actually used to actually help young people to be better engaged in their communities that we know is a protective factor as it relates to substance misuse. Next slide, please. I'm going to skim through some of these slides. The origin of Photo Voice is known as a community-based participatory action research methods there. And let's move on to the next slide, Ryan, in the interest of time. All right, and this is where what I did, in at least 3 schools, 3 different communities here, in Central Illinois. We actually engage young people to actually give us pictures that represents their identity, who they are, their agency, what do they hope to see change in their community, all right, as well as their sense of belonging. Where do they feel accepted? And these are some examples of pictures given to us by young people. All right, click the next slide, please. Next slide. All right, and these are some of those pictures, that it provides us an opportunity to engage in this dialogue, in this conversation with young people. For instance, this picture there is provided to us by, an urban high school youth that really talks about, liking the way in which it says, find your dream. And this provides us, as an adult, as a social worker, working with a young person, to really understand about this young person's dreams, all right, and his hopes and his aspiration in life. Let's click on to the next slide. Let's look at some of these pictures. This is by, a rural youth in a 6th grade, from a small city, talking about this dream car that he saw in Chicago. And these are the actual words, of young people. If you really want to be someone that can study and the stuff that you can buy, you can just follow your dreams. All right, let's look at others. Some of this, I think is really telling, as it relates to ways in which we can promote young people's sense of self, their future self. This young person was really talking about his or her interest in computers. All right, let's click the next one. All right, this actually came from one of the communities that I work with. It's led by, high crime, low income community. And it just breaks my heart in looking at some of these pictures, given to us by young people. This is an elementary urban student, which really talks about, I took pictures of money because it helps you get food and groceries. All right, that really talks about, the social economic, needs that they have. This just breaks my heart as well. All right, it's hoping for for people to just stop dying. All right, and I think this really reflects, about the voices of young people and what they really, hope to see for their self, for their future. All right, let's look at the next one there. All right, when I get older, I'm going to help with the community. All right. Now, this whole approach of, using photo voice to engage young people, we go through a whole series where we actually have prompters, and young people would actually help, we're actually helping them as it relates to perspective taking. All right, we give them like specific guidance about the pictures that they can take. We also go through the ethics of photography. So at least young people, they learn positive skills from there as well. All right, let's click the next slide there. All right, click the next one. And more importantly here, with our team here, it just doesn't just stop at the pictures that young people give us. I think this is really an opportunity for us to highlight, to elevate young people's voices within a community, to give them a sense of self and connection. And following, pictures that we have from young people, we actually hosted photo voice exhibition at parent-teacher conferences. This allows us to actually have that conversation and dialogue with parents as they're actually coming in and, meeting with their teachers. Next slide. All right, these are some of those voices, which parents, they shared with us after they actually viewed, young people's pictures. Next slide. All right, teachers, we also engage teachers to actually tell us what they think, their thoughts after looking at all these young people's voices and images that they presented. The next slide. And here we just don't only just stop with parents or even with teachers, we also bring it into the community. And last summer, what we actually did, we actually organized an event in the community. We actually hosted the exhibition, and we actually invited, if you click the next slide, Ryan, thank you. We invited, community leaders, the mayor, and other people, community partners in the agency to come in with their parents. And this is, an opportunity for us to actually highlight young people's voices. It was really cute, on this session about young people, they themselves talking to their parents and sharing with them about why they took those pictures there. And this ultimately is actually aimed at, promoting a sense of belonging, sense of membership for a young person, all right, within a community context. All right, so I think we are just exactly on time right now. Am I right, Ryan? All right.
So, yes.
Yeah. So, I think here, thinking about, what Ryan and I have just shared, let's take a moment, pause, reflect. In your school, on your kind of practice that you do, what are some specific programs or practices that you use to actually promote social and emotional learning? All right. What can you do? What are some things you can do to reimagine your programs and practices that addresses substance use? All right, let's probably take a minute or so, think about this, and I'll probably hand it over to Lily, who will facilitate a Q&A session.
Wow. This is very exciting. Thank you so much, Kevin and Ryan, for such a refreshing framework and rich content on the impact of social emotional learning on substance misuse prevention. I just love the focus on overall human flourishing, as opposed to addressing substance misuse only. It incorporates a positive lens while addressing not just substance misuse, but also high-level social emotional functioning. So it's much more inclusive. And the results from Wayne County were absolutely amazing. So thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. I would like to encourage our audience to be now posting any questions or comments or thoughts in the chat. And for me, the main takeaway of this presentation is that people are quite complex and they operate in different contexts. So people need holistic interventions that can help them thrive in many domains. In transformative SEL, universal screening and multi-layer systems of support are an important approach to help prevent substance misuse in schools, among other issues as well. So, and finally, I'd like to say that I really appreciated the inclusion of the racial trauma lens through the transformative SEL. This is a topic that's often missing, I think, in substance use disorder prevention and treatment. And we need to do a lot more work to develop the literature in this topic and in more interventions and evaluate that. So this is quite cutting edge and very, very exciting to be engaging in dialogue about this.
Thank you.
So
Lily, can I comment something about what you just said, your reflections? I think one thing that resonates a lot with me is this whole notion about not approaching a topic from a deficit-oriented lens. And I think this is really the approach that Ryan and I have also been taking. I think it is problematic, especially looking at deficits in young people. But I think it's more important for us to actually look at it from the other side of it, promoting strengths through a youth empowerment approach, looking at what Ryan mentioned, developmental assets, highlighting those assets there. I think that would be key, that would be an important approach, as it relates to working with young people.
If I might, Lily, also add a quick point. I heard you saying that the conversations around racial trauma aren't quite as present or quite as centered in and around substance use and misuse. And I would actually make the same argument about social emotional learning and positive development. Why I think the transformative social emotional learning is so important is because it's pushing back a little bit against that for a long time, that aspects of racial trauma and racial justice weren't very centered to those conversations. And so I would agree that I think that is a very important shift that has happened, and very recent shift.
And I'm excited because I think that we are becoming more aware of these issues, and more people are kind of jumping in to try to address some of those gaps. And I encourage those in our audience to also be thinking about this in your own practices and the work that you do. So people are in need now. We need to take action now. Well, before we go into the question and answer phase of the webinar, I would like for us to hear some remarks from Dr. Kalavalu Vakalahi. So if you guys could go ahead and share the video, please.
Aloha, my name is Halaivalu Vakalahi, President and CEO of the Council on Social Work Education. Thank you for joining us today. Our 4-part webinar series on reimagining substance use disorder interventions to reflect social work values is part of our commitment to CSWE's mission to advance excellence and innovation through quality and relevant social work education. We hope that this webinar series will benefit you, your colleagues, students, faculty, and staff, and your community partners. Please take advantage of the continuing education credit available on demand, free of charge. Making this webinar series possible, we want to extend our special thank you to our partners at the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, specifically the Opioid State Targeted Response Technical Assistance Grant. Again, thank you for joining us today. Until we meet again, be well.
Well, so let's start getting to some of our questions, right? I'd like to start with a question posed by a participant. who said, I am curious about the impact technology and social media has had on brain development and thus changes in SEL factors. Are you seeing anything in the literature?
Oh, that's a great question. And, I think given the impact technology has, how infused it has in our lives right now, no doubt, we need to pay more attention on that. With regards to what we are seeing in the literature, I could speak, from a K-12 context, about teachers. The pandemic, no doubt, was a big struggle, and how quickly, school pivoted to a remote platform, to a remote setting, all right? And how, to a certain extent, I do hear, and, there are also emerging studies out there that really talk about the struggles of engaging young people remotely, especially as it relates to social and emotional skills. All right. I am the editor-in-chief for Children and Schools, and I've actually seen, an insert of practice highlights articles highlighting best practices, people have done, especially in a remote platform, about engaging social and emotional skills. All right. Say, for instance, a check-in, check-out, process, how, we could have a whole series of activities, that we can really engage young people, all right, remotely. I came across an article really recently about a scavenger hunt activity that, a social worker, would do as part of his or her group work session, all right? And this is how, he or she engages, the students, in a remote platform, have a series of things, on screen. I will give you all 2 minutes. Let's see how many of these items you can really get, within your house. And there'll be like a mad scramble. All right. I thought these would be like innovative ways in which, you can really engage young people, over a remote platform. So I think this is one of those things that I'm seeing as it relates to technology and, developing social emotional skills. I don't know, Ryan, any thoughts at your end?
Yeah, I have a few. With all of the disclaimer, I'm neither a neurologist nor an expert in technology. A few things I do think I've seen. I sort of feel like they sometimes fall into studies and or arguments among educators in two different camps. They're like, how do we get rid of the technology, or how do we get the kids to put the phones away, or in the bucket of how do we engage them, how do we use this technology, in some ways, almost a social worker-esque, how do we meet them where they're at. And I think there's potentially benefits to having technology-free spaces to provide room for human connection. And I think there's a pragmatic approach to how do we use technology to engage young folks. In terms of the actual direct effect on social emotional learning, I think the short answer is I don't know. I think the longer answer is research generally doesn't know either. And where I think the suspicions lie are that the way aspects of technology, social media that we engage in are structured, how they keep someone's attention in contrast to the way in which we normally socially interact with others, right? The way in which games are programmed in order to give a little bit of a reward every time you achieve something, the way you post and you get more likes, right, kind of taps into that dopamine reward system in a way that's different from our regular social interaction. So it only makes sense, right, that someone would be more attuned to this, that's more rewarding than our interactions, with actual other people. And so there's concern there that because of that, some of the SEL piece isn't going as well with technology. From the Wayne County folks, and as a note, I know when folks came back from remote learning to schools, the teachers in Wayne County, they said pandemic was the worst year they ever had. And then the year they came back, they said the year after pandemic was the worst year they ever had. And then the third year from that, behavioral incidents, were actually still there, still a problem. And they said now it's the worst year ever. This year I think is going a little bit better. The point of all that, though, is the way the teachers are making sense of it was that self-regulation was no longer there for the students. And so behavioral incidents skyrocketed in ways that the teachers and the administration weren't ready to deal with. So those are some of the concerns I don't think we'll really know until a few more years. And so we have to think about creatively, how do we both provide technology-free spaces as well as engage with the technology. That'd be my answer.
Excellent points. So another question that we have, SEL has been implemented in schools throughout the US. Can it be translated and implemented in other settings, like including say, residential treatment? I was thinking specifically about residential drug rehabs for both adolescents and adults.
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, much that we have spoken about SEL within a school context, I think social and emotional learning is relevant across every setting, across, different groups of people that we work with, all right? I think even within, say, for instance, juvenile, setting or residential, context as well, it's also, nurturing the non-cognitive skills, within young people. They can actually promote their own successes, in life. All right, there's extensive literature out there that actually highlights that what is most important is not so much about the A's and the B's. It's not so much about academic grades, that we get, but rather our ability to be working in teams, our ability to be, engaging people. All right, and this is very much talking about those social and emotional skills there. All right, let me also highlight that, in the last couple of years, the SEL literature has also, pivoted to this whole notion about adult social and emotional learning. All right. So I think to a certain extent, the responsibility, or the way we're looking at social and emotional learning, is just not on young people, itself, but it's rather us, the adults, and our own social and emotional skills. I think this is really key, this is critical. It taps on this whole notion about transformative social and emotional learning. It is literally, our collaborative, aspects in which we can engage young people. That is really key in helping the young people grow and nurture from there, as it relates to developing young people's identity, agency, and belonging, all right? Let me also highlight one more aspect about social and emotional learning that I think is critical for us. It's also for us to take, a culturally responsive lens to really understand about social and emotional learning as well, all right? I think that's important, given that we are all working across like diverse groups, diverse settings, all right? There has been talk in the literature about how some of these social and emotional skills could be also very whitewashed as well, and how a lot of this is actually developed based off a white Caucasian perspective. All right, let me give an example. In fact, this is actually emerging some of the data that I have. Think along the lines of assertion, all right, a social and emotional skill as it relates to, standing up for yourself. Some of my data is actually highlighting that, assertion for, a white individual, a white student, might look different as compared to assertion for, a historically marginalized, student, and how adults, how say, for instance, teachers in school might misinterpret some of these assertive behaviors as being disciplinary issues. All right, and I think it's really important, as we look into this whole notion about social and emotional learning, to also look at it through a critical, culturally responsive lens as well. Dr. Heath, anything to add?
Sure, I'll add a few things. First, responding to the last thing you said regarding culturally competence, and then the centering of adults and SEL supporting other learning development. So, anecdote Kevin and I talked about before today when we were prepping for this presentation. I think it was back in 2010 or 11 or 12. We were giving a presentation on positive youth development and youth risk behaviors, and there was an individual in the presentation and during the Q&A who kind of raised their hand, asked about developmental assets in particular, and was asking aren't these developmental assets just promoting white middle upper class norms? And my reply to him was yes, I think it is. And part of that is reflecting that shift that Kevin's talking about hadn't happened yet. The centering of racial equity in the SEL conversation and positive youth development conversation hadn't happened yet. And so, didn't quite have the same language that we have now, or the attention to it that I think we have to those issues now than that we did at the time. The point I raised to that is I think folks who are tapped into this were already sensing, right, that there was a disconnect in a cultural incompetence or misalignment before that I think we're still working to rectify. Research is always a little bit behind reality and practice. So I saw that as kind of a cue, the need for this pivot that Kevin's talking about. regarding that pivot, something else that struck me, even when we were doing this presentation, is looking at the different definitions, right? I gave Castle's kind of first definition of social emotional learning, right? It's the young people gathering these abilities. And then Kevin gave the transformative social emotional learning, right? It starts with adults and the relationships between youth and adults. And right, it's putting the onus on us as adults with institutions to be providing the opportunities and context for young people to be engaging in this learning. And I think that can happen across contexts. In the case of schools, right, SEL was largely pitched and sold to schools as this can help academic learning. And really, right, it's human development more broadly. And so for me, someone who's primarily worked in schools and not other settings, I could see that working well in settings like residential. To your question, Lily, right? It's about how social emotional learning is, can be leveraged to assist in other learning. And so instead of, hey, how do I self-regulate myself in a classroom? Hey, how do I self-regulate when there are urges? How do I self-regulate when I get back home out of residential and my two friends and my dad are drinking, right? So that's how I'd potentially see it applicable to some of those other settings.
Yes, I appreciate that. I really like the framework. I think that it does tap into a lot of the challenges that substance use disorder treatments are trying to address, but it doesn't really put it within that framework. And I think that, if we were to focus more on transformative social emotional learning within those settings as well, I think that would be really surprised in how helpful it can be in leading for reduced substance use as kind of like another consequence of not just helping people survive, but helping them thrive, right? Mm-hmm. It's more than just stopping the use and perhaps still being miserable, but how can I really be a full rounded, happy, accomplished person in society?
How might we build the institutions in society, right, where young people don't self-medicate because of the racial trauma they've experienced, the ACEs they've had in their life, right? How do we create a world and society where young people can thrive in a holistic way rather than just don't smoke that pot?
Yep, absolutely.
And I think this, highlights the whole notion about us engaging young people to also reflect and think about, notions about oppression, notions about privilege, notions about systemic injustices. I think transformative social and emotional learning is really one approach, for us to be engaging young people in that dialogue. I think it's really powerful about us as the adults to be doing that with young people. I think first thing first, it helps them feel validated. I think secondly, it helps them to feel like empowered. I think more importantly, I think it goes around this whole notion about cultural humility. Whereas, for us as adults, as teachers, or even as social workers, what we can do to actually bring ourselves down, at a client's level, all right, to be really mindful of our own power, privilege, that we actually bring into the whole helping process. I think to me, that's really the whole power of transformative social and emotional learning. It's an opportunity for us to reimagine the work that we do.
Yep. Absolutely love that, Kevin. Thank you so much. Now, I am looking here at the time, so we're going to start wrapping up. Crystal, do you have any messages for the audience in terms of CEUs or anything? I know that the PowerPoints are going to be shared, but if you could,
Yes, absolutely. CE information will be available along with the webinar video within 24 hours of this session. So you guys can go on the Learning Academy site to view that.
All right, well, fantastic. Thank you so much for attending. And we look forward to continuing the conversation next month on May 17th with Dr. Mendersheed and Ms. Deb Steinberg on substance use disorder policy changes and opportunities for social workers. Thank you very much and be well. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.